On April 24, 1944, 24,000 feet above Brandenburg, Major Gunther Rall found himself pressed deep into the seat of his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6, his oxygen mask fogging with every heavy, labored breath. He watched in utter disbelief as an American fighter not only matched his maneuver through a diving turn, but maintained a relentless pursuit, defying all previous combat experience. Through the static of his earphones, the usually composed voices of Jagdgeschwader 11's finest pilots, men who had dominated the European skies since 1940, were now shouting warnings with the panic of novices. Rall heard the desperate call, "Indian at 6 o'clock high!" Yet the enemy was still sticking to him at 400 kilometers per hour, breaking the iron law of aerial combat that had governed the war for 3 years. It was a widely held certainty that American fighters simply lacked the range, altitude performance, and speed to follow the Luftwaffe home. Yet the P-51B Mustang currently bearing down on his wingman shattered every assumption that had kept German pilots alive since 1941. The Mustang's Packard-built Merlin engine screamed with power at an altitude where earlier American Thunderbolts and Lightnings would have been gasping for thin air. Despite being 600 miles from its base in England, this aircraft still possessed enough fuel for another hour of combat and the return journey, while Rall's own gauge indicated a mere 15 minutes of flight time remaining to reach Brandenburg. In a single morning, the complex mathematics of air superiority, distance, altitude, and endurance had been completely overturned. The hunters had suddenly become the hunted over their own capital, and what Major Rall witnessed that April morning was not just the arrival of a new fighter, but the beginning of the Luftwaffe's systematic annihilation. Within a year, the force that had once terrorized Europe would lose 75% of its pilots and 90% of its experienced leaders, ceding complete air superiority over Germany itself. This destruction was wrought by a weapon designed in just 102 days, powered by a British engine and produced in numbers that defied all German comprehension. This crisis had been building since August 17, 1943, when the U.S. 8th Air Force lost 60 B-17 flying fortresses in a single day while attacking Schweinfurt and Regensburg. The mathematics of the bombing campaign had reached a critical inflection point, with American bombers suffering 20 to 25% losses on deep penetration raids, while German fighter production was actually increasing despite the Allied efforts. Generalleutnant Adolf Galland, the general of fighters, reviewed these figures with satisfaction at his Berlin headquarters, noting that the Americans were losing bombers faster than they could train crews. With each B-17 carrying 10 highly trained specialists, requiring months of preparation, the Luftwaffe was effectively trading one fighter pilot for 10 bomber crew members, an exchange rate that decisively favored Germany. Galland had confidently told his staff in September 1943 that American fighters lacked the range to escort beyond the Rhine, meaning German forces could simply wait for the escorts to turn back at Aachen and then massacre the bombers at their leisure. This strategy seemed to work perfectly when, on October 14th, known as Black Thursday, the 8th Air Force lost another 60 bombers and 650 men attacking Schweinfurt, causing the American bombing campaign to grind to a halt for 4 months. The Luftwaffe appeared to have won the battle for air superiority through the simple advantage of geography. But unknown to the celebrating German pilots, an extraordinary convergence of engineering genius and industrial might was already reversing their victory. The North American P-51 Mustang had originated from a British requirement in April 1940, designed in a mere 102 days, with the prototype taking flight just 149 days after the contract was signed, a speed impossible for any other nation. While the early Mustangs, powered by the Allison V1710 engine, proved disappointing above 15,000 feet where bomber escort was most needed, a pivotal change occurred in April 1942. Rolls-Royce test pilot Ronald Harker suggested fitting the airframe with the Merlin engine, a marriage of American aerodynamics and British power that would ultimately produce the war's most decisive fighter aircraft. By August 1941, the Packard Motor Company in Detroit had begun license production, applying American mass production techniques to British precision engineering to deliver hundreds of engines monthly, each generating approximately 1,650 horsepower. Colonel Thomas Hitchcock, the American military attaché in London and a former World War I pilot, wrote a prophetic report in July 1942 predicting that the P-51 with the Merlin engine would be superior to any existing fighter above 25,000 feet and change the entire strategic situation in Europe. On December 1, 1943, a formation of Focke-Wulf FW-190s from Jagdgeschwader II approached American bombers near Solingen, confident that the escorts had already turned back. These veteran pilots, possessing thousands of combined victories, prepared to execute a well-rehearsed attack pattern perfected over 18 months, watching with relief as the P-47 Thunderbolts waggled their wings in farewell to the bombers. As the German fighters rolled into their dive, however, urgent warnings crackled through their radios that Indians, enemy fighters, were still maintaining escort with a new type of aircraft. 8 P-51B Mustangs of the 354th Fighter Group, the Pioneer Unit, had remained with the bombers. Utilizing drop tanks, they provided an extra 150 miles of range to extend coverage deep into Germany. Conditioned by 18 months of uncontested attacks on unescorted bombers, the German pilots were psychologically unprepared for fighter opposition at such a distance. The shock deepened on December 13, 1943, when the first major raid with substantial P-51 escort penetrated all the way to Kiel, 420 miles from the nearest Allied base. The 16 P-51Bs of the 354th Fighter Group revolutionized escort duties by abandoning passive defense in favor of aggressive fighter sweeps, actively hunting the enemy rather than awaiting attack. This shift was immediately felt by Major Georg Peter Eder, the commander of 2/JG-1, who encountered these Mustangs near Bremen. A seasoned veteran with 78 aerial victories, Eder had devised specific countermeasures for every Allied aircraft, knowing the P-47 could be outmaneuvered at altitude and the Spitfire lacked endurance. Yet, the P-51 defied all existing categorizations. Upon making first contact at an altitude of 7,500 meters, Eder transmitted a sobering report to Jagdkorps headquarters, noting that the enemy fighters maintained speed and maneuverability far superior to the Bf-109G at that height. He described how his Staffel was pursued for 30 kilometers until fuel constraints forced his unit to land, whereas the American escorts continued their mission with no apparent concern for their fuel reserves. The psychological impact of this new threat was captured in the diary of Oberfeldwebel Heinz Knoker, a 33-victory ace with JG-11, who wrote on December 20th that the appearance of American fighters over Hanover had shaken the entire force. Where they once took off leisurely to engage approaching bombers, confident in their time to gain altitude, they were now forced to climb immediately or face the lethal risk of being bounced by escorts on the runway, bringing the war directly to their doorstep. When German intelligence finally obtained accurate performance data for the P-51B in January 1944, the figures caused disbelief at the highest levels of the Luftwaffe. The aircraft boasted a top speed of 440 miles per hour at 30,000 feet, faster than any German fighter at altitude, and a range of 2,080 miles with drop tanks, which was double that of any adversary. Furthermore, its service ceiling of 42,000 feet allowed it to operate comfortably above the effective reach of most German pilots. The Mustang ascended at 3,475 feet per minute, outperforming the Bf-109G above 20,000 feet, while its armament of 6 50-caliber machine guns with 1,880 rounds provided ample firepower for extended combat. This performance was underpinned by the unprecedented efficiency of the laminar flow wing, which maintained smooth airflow over 60% of its chord and reduced drag by 30% compared to conventional designs, a single innovation that made long-range escort viable. During Big Week, from February 20th to the 25th, 1944, the full weight of American air power struck aircraft factories across Germany, with over 1,000 bombers and 900 fighters, including 150 P-51Bs. In these coordinated raids, American fighters transitioned from passive escorts to active hunters, costing the Luftwaffe 355 fighters and, more critically, approximately 100 experienced pilots, including dozens of formation leaders. The deaths of these Staffelkapitane and Gruppenkommandeur represented a catastrophic loss of irreplaceable tactical knowledge. Their absence cascaded through the fighter force, stripping the squadrons of vital mentorship and leaving inexperienced pilots to face an increasingly dominant enemy without the guidance necessary to survive. A pivotal watershed moment arrived on March 4, 1944, with the first American bombing raid on Berlin under fighter escort, where 660 B-17s and B-24s darkened the skies over the Reich capital, protected by Mustangs, Lightnings, and Thunderbolts. The general of fighters, Adolf Galland, personally led a scratch force of Bf-109Gs against the raid, later submitting a brutally honest after-action report to Goering regarding the hopeless disparity in forces. Galland reported being outnumbered 3-1, noting that the Mustangs possessed advantages in altitude, speed, and tactics, which allowed them to chase him for 50 kilometers and toy with him like cats with a mouse. This visible dominance shattered the last pretense of German air superiority, as civilians who had been assured of the Luftwaffe's victory watched in horror as silver Mustangs performed loops over the Brandenburg Gate, causing the regime's credibility to crumble. By April 1944, P-51 pilots had adopted a devastating tactic of descending to treetop level after escort duties to strafe targets of opportunity, turning previously safe German airfields into killing grounds. This new reality was exemplified on April 13th, when 42 Mustangs from the 4th Fighter Group, after escorting bombers to Schweinfurt, descended upon Bavaria to destroy 51 aircraft on the ground and damage 23 more in just 30 minutes of concentrated attacks. By May 1944, the Luftwaffe faced a catastrophic pilot shortage, with monthly losses exceeding 25% of operational strength, forcing them to rely on training programs that produced increasingly inferior replacements. While American pilots received 400 hours of training, the average German pilot in 1944 logged only 110 to 160 hours, a sharp decline from the 220 to 250 hours provided in 1941. And by early 1945, some entered combat with as little as 80 hours total flight time. Oberst Johannes Mackie Steinhoff of JG-77 documented this crisis, lamenting that they were receiving 19-year-old boys with minimal training who had never flown above 5,000 meters or fired at a moving target. He noted the futility of sending these novices, who had never experienced high-G maneuvers, against American pilots who possessed 400 hours of training and significant combat experience. The quality differential acted as a force multiplier for American effectiveness, a fact observed by Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group, who would eventually score 21 aerial victories. Gentile noted that by the spring of 1944, half the German pilots were easy kills who flew predictable patterns and panicked under attack, while the dangerous old hands became increasingly rare, identifiable only by their superior flying, distinct from the novices. The strategic bombing campaign against German oil facilities, which intensified in May 1944, created an additional crisis that compounded the advantages of the P-51. As aviation fuel production plummeted from 180,000 tons in April to just 20,000 tons by September, German training flights were eliminated and combat operations were restricted, while American pilots freely flew training missions over Germany itself. P-51 units executed aggressive fighter sweeps and offensive patrols, missions specifically designed to hunt down and annihilate German aircraft. With ample fuel reserves, you would find American pilots loitering directly over enemy airfields, waiting to ambush defenders the moment they attempted to take off, striking when the enemy was most vulnerable. The introduction of the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter in the summer of 1944 briefly raised German hopes, as Hitler viewed it as a wonder weapon capable of reversing the air war's trajectory. Boasting a top speed of 540 miles per hour, the jet was a full 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51D, presenting a formidable new challenge. However, Mustang pilots quickly devised tactics to neutralize the jet's technological edge, primarily by hovering near Me-262 bases and attacking during the slow, critical phases of takeoff and landing. The Mustang's superior range allowed you to wait patiently for these opportunities, effectively rendering the speed advantage useless. Furthermore, the Me-262's theoretical superiority was crippled by operational realities. The jets required high-grade fuel that was increasingly unavailable, and their engines needed replacement every 10 to 25 hours, an impossibility given the disrupted supply chains. The most critical deficiency for the Luftwaffe was the lack of experienced aviators required to operate these complex machines effectively. While notable aces like Franz Schall, credited with shooting down 10 P-51s, and Georg Peter Eder, who claimed 9 Mustangs among his 12 jet victories, achieved individual brilliance, these successes offered no strategic salvation. For every Mustang brought down, dozens more appeared to take its place, overwhelming the few remaining veterans. By the autumn of 1944, P-51 groups shifted their focus to dismantling Germany's transportation network, operating in squadron-strength units to obliterate locomotives, rail yards, bridges, and canal locks. This campaign triggered a systematic collapse of the German economy, which was heavily reliant on rail logistics. On September 11, 1944, 36 P-51s from the 357th Fighter Group destroyed 81 locomotives in a single day, illustrating the devastating efficiency of these ground attacks. The 357th Fighter Group would eventually claim the highest number of air victories of any 8th Air Force P-51 group, with a total of 595.5 kills. The impact of such dominance was recorded by Reich Minister Albert Speer, who noted in his diary that American fighters had accomplished what heavy bombers could not: complete transportation paralysis. He lamented that coal could no longer reach power plants, components failed to arrive at factories, and food supplies were cut off from the cities. Beyond the cold logic of strategy and statistics, the supremacy of the P-51 inflicted deep psychological trauma on German pilots, shattering the worldview of men who had once considered themselves elite warriors. You could see the demoralization in the enemy ranks as Mustang pilots displayed absolute confidence, performing aggressive aerobatics over German cities and executing victory rolls over the very airfields they had just strafed. This overwhelming presence gave rise to fatalistic humor among the Germans, with one popular joke asking what a fighter pilot needed for an Iron Cross, only to answer, a P-51 escort to the cemetery. This desperation culminated on April 7, 1945, during the Sonderkommando Elbe operation, one of the Luftwaffe's final large-scale sorties. In a frantic suicide mission, approximately 180 to 200 Bf-109s, flown largely by inexperienced volunteers, attempted to ram American bombers. The outcome was catastrophic, with American fighters destroying approximately 130 to 140 German aircraft, while sustaining minimal losses themselves. Following the events of April 1945, the Luftwaffe effectively ceased to exist as a cohesive fighting force. Although planes and pilots were still physically present, the collective will to resist had evaporated, leading unit commanders to stop ordering missions entirely. A force that had once terrorized a continent was reduced to concealing its remaining machines, marking the total disintegration of German air power. The final production and combat statistics of the P-51 tell the complete story of its impact, with a total of 15,586 aircraft manufactured. In aerial combat, Mustangs accounted for 4,950 confirmed enemy kills, while destroying another 4,131 on the ground. Against these figures, P-51 losses from all causes stood at 2,520, resulting in an aerial combat kill ratio of approximately 3.6 to 1. The human cost for the Luftwaffe was staggering, with over 8,000 pilots killed or missing on the Western Front in 1944, followed by another 3,000 between January and May of 1945. This attrition decimated the fighter force, shrinking operational strength from approximately 1,600 fighters in January 1944 to just 325 by April 1945. The disparity in pilot quality became equally pronounced as American aviators in 1944 and 45 entered combat with over 400 hours of training. In stark contrast, German pilot training plummeted from 160 to 220 hours in early 1944, down to 110 to 160 hours later that year, and finally to as few as 80 hours by 1945. Military historians universally credit the P-51 with a decisive role in securing Allied dominion over the skies. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey concluded that this fighter, more than any other single weapon, won air superiority over Europe. It enabled three pivotal achievements: the continuation of daylight strategic bombing, the establishment of air dominance prior to D-Day, and the systematic destruction of Germany's oil and transportation infrastructure. The industrial miracle behind this success deserves recognition, particularly North American Aviation's ability to roll out a completed Mustang approximately every 90 minutes at peak capacity. The manufacturing plants in Englewood and Dallas employed tens of thousands of workers, with women comprising 40% of this massive workforce. This output stood in stark contrast to the German effort. While exact German figures are disputed due to incomplete records, it is clear that American production of P-51s alone exceeded the total German output of all single-engine fighter types combined during 1944 and 45. Just as decisive as the hardware was the American pilot training system, which by 1944 had become one of the largest educational programs in history. Every pilot progressed through a rigorous curriculum, completing 65 hours of primary training, 75 hours of basic training, 100 hours of advanced training, and finally, over 160 hours of operational training before ever facing the enemy. This methodical training structure ensured that Allied aviators joined their combat units, boasting over 400 hours of flight time, having already mastered gunnery, formation tactics, and combat maneuvers. In sharp contrast, German pilots were increasingly rushed to the front lines, possessing barely enough experience to handle their aircraft safely, let alone fight with any degree of effectiveness. The legacy of the P-51 extends far beyond the Second World War, serving as enduring proof that air superiority is achieved through a synthesis of logistics, technology, and training, rather than individual prowess alone. Even the former Luftwaffe ace, Adolf Galland, later conceded that while the Mustang may not have outperformed German fighters in every technical metric, it was excellent in all the ways that mattered, backed by limitless resources and flown by expert crews, a combination that proved impossible to beat. Decades later, at a NATO conference in 1975, General Günther Rall, who had survived the conflict with 275 victories, reflected on how the Mustang did more than just defeat the German Air Force. It shattered their entire concept of aerial warfare. He noted that while the Germans focused on tactical duels and individual skill, the Americans operated on a scale of systems, mass production, and strategic dominance, effectively waging a different kind of war entirely. The shift in power was absolute, as the Luftwaffe, which had once swept across Europe from 1939 to 1941 and nearly brought Britain to its knees, was systematically dismantled by American industrial democracy given wings. While the P-51 Mustang was the physical instrument of this devastation, the true weapon was the society behind it, a nation capable of designing a fighter in just 102 days, manufacturing over 15,000 of them, and training thousands of professional pilots to project power across the oceans. Those German pilots who dismissed American capabilities in 1943 failed to foresee the Mustang's dominance because they fundamentally misjudged the nation that created it. They saw only individual aircraft where they should have recognized the overwhelming force of assembly lines and training programs. By the time they comprehended the true nature of this industrial might, the dynamic had shifted irrevocably. The hunters had become the hunted, and the European skies were firmly under the control of the Mustangs. The destruction of the Luftwaffe was more than a military defeat. It was a testament to the fact that a fully mobilized, free society could generate power that totalitarian systems could not even comprehend. In the end, the Mustang proved that modern victory relies not on warrior myths or racial superiority, but on the concrete realities of production and logistics, a lesson the enemy learned only when staring down the barrels of 6.50 caliber machine guns above the burning ruins of the Third Reich.